A had become a zombie during the apocalypse, a completely normal zombie. To increase his chances of survival, A decided he would become even stronger, getting a body he could have never had in life. And with that, he ended up becoming the king of all the undead. His next step now is to deal with humanity. The multi-car train moves calmly along its track. Many people are crossing the tracks as if they don't know that a collision with a locomotive is fatal. The desperate train conductor tries to warn the fools to get out of the way, as he has lost control of the train. Finally, the clueless people realize the huge locomotive is out of control. Desperate to survive, people start running, but a stroller will get stuck. A mother with a baby in her arms, reluctant to abandon the stroller, refuses to let it go, unwilling to lose something that is practically useless. The others try to warn her that she's running out of time, while another woman closes her eyes, unable to watch the impending tragedy. In just a few moments, that woman would have been reduced to a pile of human paste. Her luck was that a mysterious figure was in the crowd. In the blink of an eye, everything became a blur. Instead of saving the woman, the protagonist thought it would be easier to destroy the locomotive, stopping it by force. The train cars derailed with the potential to cause an even greater catastrophe. However, the woman and her child were alive, struggling to understand what had just happened. Standing before her was that mysterious man, his face hidden from view. Turning to the woman, the protagonist asked if she was okay. Still in shock, the woman was deeply grateful for being saved, but her gratitude quickly gave way to an expression of pure terror. Even the baby in her arms was petrified. That being, definitely, looked like a zombie. The woman's desperate scream echoed through the air. The protagonist's name is Zombie. His name is, literally, what defines him, a zombie. A had just woken up and was getting out of bed, unsure of his own existence, or when he had become such a creature. Despite everything, A had a dream just like anyone else. A wished to befriend humans so that the discrimination would end. With that goal in mind, A had been working tirelessly every day, believing that one day, after much effort, A would succeed. His confidence was unshakable, and A truly believed in his dream. While brushing his teeth, A lost another one because, after all, he was a zombie. In pursuit of his dream, A had lost count of how many people A had helped. An out-of-control plane was on a collision course with a crowded stadium. The crowd panicked, scrambling to evacuate, creating chaos and disorder, until a little boy pointed out the unthinkable. The plane hadn't crashed as expected. That massive object had been stopped by a single being, leaving the entire crowd in stunned silence. The building was engulfed in flames. The fire raged uncontrollably as a woman screamed that her children were still inside. To the complete astonishment of the firefighters, a zombie emerged from the building carrying 5 children. He wasn't that strong, or at least not as he remembered being in life. It all started with a zombie pandemic. This was the beginning of the apocalypse. At that time, he was still a student. Everything happened so fast that he didn't have a chance to escape it. This led to him becoming a completely normal zombie, just like everyone else. He was just another one following the crowd, moving only as directed by the larger mass. One fateful day, armed women appeared, aiming their weapons at everyone. The zombies were exterminated in large numbers, treated like pests. Their bodies were burned and used as fuel. While the survivors became the engines of infinite energy mechanisms, the zombies had become a source of electricity for humanity. However, the protagonist didn't understand why humans hated zombies or why zombies crave human flesh. To survive, he decided to change his behavior and began to train rigorously. He lifted weights, ran, swam, and jumped every single day without fail. An independent life begins with one's own effort, and he didn't feed on flesh. His meals consisted of whey protein, which he consumed 3 times a day. Although his exhaustion was immense, he continued to train late into the night, until one day he finally became truly strong. He had become practically invincible, with an aesthetic yet monstrously powerful body. After gaining strength and knowledge, he decided to approach the nearest human city. He tried to get them to see zombies in a different light. His wish was to live within the human walls to be a good zombie. Inside his house, he continued with his daily chores, realizing that his food supplies had run out. With that, it was time to go to the market to restock. It was a beautiful day outside. The sky was clear and bright. The protagonist went to the market he usually frequented to replenish his supplies. The clerk who helped him asked if it wasn't uncomfortable to wear that mask all the time. The protagonist replied that, Contrary to what she thought, it was actually quite comfortable. The employees went to the truck to load his purchased goods. A suspicious glint outside revealed that the protagonist was being watched. Some reporters wanted to confirm if it was really him. They wanted to clear his throat, see what was under that mask. They were doing everything they could to gather any clues about the zombie's identity. Holding a flyer in his hand, he realized that one of his friends was wanted again. That was Gu, who had probably done something to injure humanity once again. The cameraman wondered if this person was really the same one who had stopped an airplane with his bare hands, while his boss admitted they might be mistaken. Maybe it had all been a media exaggeration. That's why they needed to uncover the identity behind this masked figure. However, they ended up witnessing something so absurd it left them completely speechless. The citizen they had been watching had just lifted that truck with his bare hands. The protagonist looked up patiently as if he were calculating a trajectory. The ground beneath his feet began to crack completely. Suddenly, the truck disappeared because it was now high up in the air. It was such an incredible sight that the reporters couldn't comprehend what had just happened, and in fact, it was such a powerful jump that the protagonist had managed to reach orbit. Far from there, a heavily guarded fence stood with clear warnings that passage was strictly forbidden. On the other side of the fence, several erratic zombies were wandering aimlessly. In their own language, a little girl told her mother she was hungry. The mother told the little one to hold on a bit longer. Apparently, zombies were capable of reproducing. Don't ask how. Illuminated by the moonlight, the powerful zombie crashed down in the middle of the devastated city. On his back was a truck completely full of supplies. The vehicle was carefully placed on the ground. This brought joy to the zombies who realized their king had returned. A child asked why it didn't just drive the truck like humans do. Unfortunately, it didn't have a driver's license, so it had to do things this way. This was a city he himself had conquered far from the human villages, where the zombies fed on eggs to avoid attacking people. Turning to the child, he asked where Gu and the others were. The little one said they were all in the Hado lounge. The protagonist headed to the location to meet with these creators. Everyone present was of an extremely high threat level. The mere gathering of such powerful beings was a calamity in itself. Even more absurd was the fact that they all greeted the protagonist as their supreme majesty. Handing the flyer to one of his subordinates, he informed them that Gu was being hunted again by humans. The powerful creature apologized, saying that he always lost control whenever he saw a human. The protagonist walked over to a sofa and took a seat. One of his subordinates reported that their numbers were growing, but to stay hidden from humans, they had already relocated several times. The most reckless one among them wanted to start a massacre. He was eager to use his chainsaw as soon as possible. After hearing this, the protagonist warned that humans could also be terrifying. They were soon interrupted by a strange sound etching in the sky above the city. The noise was coming from an airship approaching at high speed. Inside was a woman with two exceptionally well-bred twins. You could see their health and good upbringing just by looking at them. The woman stood inside the airship, radiating confidence, as if she were the true protagonist of this story. She seemed to be analyzing data on a massive screen, reviewing the details of the current mission. Her staff assured the president that everything was in order, clear and stable with no signs of interference. The team was ready for deployment. The payload had also been checked, a nuclear weapon set to detonate 20 minutes after activation. The protagonist noticed the unusual approach of the humans. High above, inside the aircraft, the powerful president crossed her arms, hugging her twins. She could hardly wait for the zombies to experience the devastating power of her nuclear weapon. She hated them all. As the aircraft drew closer, the sound of its engines became more deafening. One of the creators alerted the others that humans were responsible for the noise. He wanted his leader's permission to eliminate them all, but the protagonist ordered that the priority was to evacuate the citizens. His subordinate had to hold back. He lost control way too easily. Faced with this crisis, the responsibility of handling everything fell on him. Inside the aircraft, the president tried to communicate with the ground team. She informed the soldiers they had 20 minutes to rescue the remaining civilians and evacuate the area. Repeating the order, the squad confirmed they understood. At one of the aircraft's exits stood Marshall, one of humanity's greatest heroes, responsible for intercepting any powerful zombies that might appear. Dressed in impressive armor and wielding a formidable sword, he patiently waited for the action. He assured the president that she could leave everything to him. If any strong zombie showed up, it would slice it up without hesitation. On the ground, the mass of creatures was doing its best to keep fleeing. Elsewhere, they were being watched by a mysterious long-haired man. A strange-looking guy informed his superior, Phi, that the people from the extraordinary academy had found their zombies. A wonderful situation, because now they could play with these people. Pressing a button, a cage full of human prisoners appeared. They were released into the middle of the zombie horde. The ground team detected human life signs and began to prepare to move to that location. Properly position it with their machine guns, they opened fire. Against security protocol, a girl had taken off her protective helmet, and not yet that the zombie refused to die. The poor zombie boy closed his eyes in terror, convinced Phi was about to be killed once again. But standing in front of him was the great protagonist, whose sheer power was so overwhelming that even normal clothes became bulletproof just by him wearing them. A more determined soldier, reluctant to believe in the existence of invulnerable zombies, decided it was time to let his bazooka sing the song of its people. It unleashed a devastating blast of firepower at the creature. A massive explosion erupted exactly as the soldiers expected, and some thick smoke filled the air. One soldier approached his superior, suggesting that maybe this wasn't an ordinary zombie, but an extraordinary individual, known for saving people. He was famous for always wearing an incredibly realistic mask that made him look like a zombie. Now the soldier was completely terrified, realizing he might have attacked the wrong person. When the smoke cleared, the protagonist emerged completely unharmed from everything that had happened so far. Inside the aircraft, the president continued to analyze the conflict data. She informed Marshall that a powerful zombie had appeared in the combat zone. The warrior immediately requested to handle the situation personally. Without any protective gear, he launched himself from the aircraft, diving straight into the battle. Meanwhile, elsewhere, those Mr. Figures continued to watch the events unfold. They noticed that almost all the people had already been saved. Perhaps they had underestimated their opponents. The long-haired man then declared it was time to make things more interesting. Immediately, the young man with a rat-like face understood exactly what they were about to do. In the middle of the zombie horde, they activated something that began to alter one of them. Its eyes changed, and one of its arms started to grow uncontrollably. What was once a completely ordinary zombie had transformed into a gigantic and dangerous monstrosity. The protagonist was still there protecting his friends when he saw the monstrous transformation. As the creature roared wildly, the armored man rushed onto the battlefield. The ground squad received an alert about the appearance of a boss-level zombie. With that information, they immediately mobilized toward the new threat. To everyone's surprise, the squad leader immediately began to retreat without a second thought. However, his actions were soon understood. Still filled with remorse, if the goal was to save the life of that extraordinary person, then he had no choice. With the protagonist in his arms, he moved further and further away from the center of danger. He placed him inside the evacuation vehicle. Once inside the armored transporter, he ordered the driver to speed up immediately. They had lives to save. It didn't take long for the vehicle to speed off, tears screeching. Inside the Melero truck, the girl expressed her curiosity about the identity of this person, especially why he always wore that same mask. Questioned so directly, the protagonist didn't know how to respond. At the heart of the battle, the ground troops were stunned. The monstrous zombie had just lifted an entire bus. Its strength was so overwhelming that it hurled the vehicle at the soldiers as if it were made of paper. Before disaster could strike, the samurai warrior arrived on the battlefield. With a single swing of his blade, he sliced the bus cleanly in two. The wreckage hit the ground, revealing how precise the cut had been. The soldiers cheered. If the samurai from the academy was here, victory was certain. Approaching the creature, the samurai ordered the soldiers to continue the evacuation. The monster was now his responsibility. Civilians were being evacuated little by little. The squad leader was informed that the dangerous zombie had already been intercepted. Among the humans, the protagonist recognized a voice that felt strangely familiar. The girl reassured him, saying not to worry. They were there to help. That's when he noticed something strange. The massive human they had fought so hard to save had disappeared. Marshall turned to the creature before him and asked if it felt any pain. The zombie roared in pure rage, completely uncontrolled. It was obvious that it had no command over its own actions, like a wild beast, and lunged at the samurai. The warrior prepared to draw his sword. Faster than the eye could see, the samurai moved past the creature, his blade already sheathed. He had delivered countless cuts in an instant, determined to end its suffering. It all happened too fast. Marshall had executed the battle flawlessly. The zombie's body began showing signs of being sliced beyond its limits. It collapsed, torn apart, lifeless. Marshall slowly wiped his blade, convinced that his job was done. Looking at the remains on the ground, he wished the poor creature could finally rest in peace. But then, faint footsteps caught his attention. Someone else was there. Seeing the unknown figure approach the fallen creature, he wondered if this was another zombie. The protagonist gazed at his former companion, grief evident in his eyes as if mourning a loss. Inside the separate aircraft, the rest of the team received confirmation that the zombie had been completely eliminated. The president congratulated Marshall on his achievement, suggesting they record the event as part of his legacy. The protagonist apologized for what had happened. Not all of them were capable of controlling themselves. Hearing the mysterious figure speak in the plural, Marshall immediately assumed he was a zombie as well. Without a shred of hesitation, he had already unleashed his first strike against the protagonist. At that moment, the support team detected the emergence of yet another boss-level zombie. The young officer shrugged it off, saying there was no need to worry. Just give Marshall the order and it would finish the job. But the girl was already terrified. The samurai's signal had completely vanished. It had happened so quickly that even the president grew apprehensive about what might have occurred. Marshall's face was wounded as if had been struck. His body was now hanging from the top of a streetlight, and the armor on Sagor was gone. His life signals were faint. He had suffered severe damage. The situation was becoming dire for the humans as the evacuation had not yet been completed. Looking at the unfolding crisis, the president grew deeply and genuinely enraged. Someone needed to take action to prevent the worst from happening. Shocking her entire team, she descended from the aircraft, heading straight into the battle. Her team, alarmed, called out that she was being reckless. She couldn't just go down there all alone. She was already preparing her first strike, determined to gouge this creator's strength for herself. The protagonist was taken by surprise, not expecting another human to show up so quickly. The president, however, was even more astonished. Her sword had shattered as if it were made of glass. She took a moment to process what had just happened, while the protagonist barely felt anything more than a light tap on his head. Now she was genuinely scared, struggling to comprehend what kind of creature could be as tough as steel. Realizing he was far stronger than she had initially assumed, she began to put some distance between them. Her team warned her that due to the force of her initial strike, they couldn't apply reinforcements to help her. With what was left of her broken sword, the president assured them she was fine. Taking advantage of this brief window of opportunity, the protagonist tried to apologize, saying he'd already done so with the samurai. She was stunned by his ability to speak, realizing this creature had to be some kind of mutant. This only made her draw an even more powerful weapon. With her enchanted sword in hand, the president prepared for another devastating attack. The protagonist grew despaired. He didn't want to fight and wished she would just listen. Brimming with aggression, the president declared she could do her talking with the edge of her sword. Her first attack missed, as he dodged it with ease. But that didn't end the battle. She had already repositioned it herself. She was now behind him. It turned to find her ready to strike once more, executing one of her signature moves. The president unleashed a sweeping slash. Everything around her was cleanly cut by her blade, but the protagonist managed to evade the attack in true Matrix style. The blow was so powerful that even the surrounding buildings were heavily damaged. Everything was happening too fast, and the protagonist was genuinely impressed by her combat skill. However, the president was growing more and more enraged, assuming the creator was just toying with her. Nearby, the soldiers were retrieving the injured samurai. His brutal beatdown had been so severe that he could barely speak. Finally, the president received word that the evacuation had been successfully completed. Now, she too could retreat. Deeply focused in the heat of battle, one of her aides urgently asked if she had heard the order, but by then, she and the protagonist were already racing through the abandoned city, moving like two ninjas. The protagonist did everything he could to get away from the furious woman. Meanwhile, the president grew even more infuriated, realizing the creator had no intention of engaging in combat. It pointed out that if he didn't try to run, she would never stop trying to slice him up. With just a few leaps, the protagonist managed to create an efficient distance between them. This only fueled her fury even more. This time, she was determined to show him the second extension of her techniques. At that moment, her legs were revealed to be prosthetics, and steam began to vent from her body. Now at full power, the president covered a massive distance with a single leap. The protagonist, who had thought he was comfortably getting away, was suddenly caught off guard by the president's reappearance. With rage overflowing in her eyes, she launched another devastating attack. She landed hard on the ground after executing her strike. Moments later, the protagonist also came crashing down, hitting the ground like a sack of potatoes. Believing her target was completely eliminated, the president sheathed her sword. She then ordered the airship to begin lowering its altitude so they could ready-aim him. The person most disappointed with this outcome was the rat-faced man. After all, every single one of the citizens had been safely evacuated, but the story was far from over, as they still had a spy within the organization. The rescued civilians were celebrating, relieved to have been successfully saved. Inside the cockpit, the pilot suddenly heard something suspicious. Turning to the side, Faye was met with a disturbing sight. Someone had pressed a button that posed an extreme danger to them all. The nuclear warhead inside the airship had been launched. It was now falling, heading straight for the survivors. Unaware of this, the civilians continued to celebrate, assuming the mission was over. The pilot quickly informed the crew that they shouldn't be celebrating. There was a spy among them, and the warhead had been deployed. Upon hearing these grim words, the crew was in complete shock. The rescued civilians were now overcome with absolute terror. It was time to inform the president that there was a threat among them and she needed to escape immediately. Unfortunately, she was paralyzed by the sheer horror of the situation. The nuclear bomb was descending toward the city and nothing could stop it now. They were taking the necessary measures to minimize the damage, as extracting the president was now a top priority. She tried to use her prosthetic enhancements, but immediately realized something was terribly wrong. Time was running out, and fast. The president was still outside the plane. At that moment, she struggled to activate the acceleration on her prosthetics. She had completely drained the battery while fighting a mutant she hadn't managed to defeat. Apparently, she had forgotten to change the power cells in her prosthetics before going into battle, a truly regrettable mistake. Still distracted by her depleted batteries, she suddenly realized the zombie was standing right next to her, completely alive. Without a word, he grabbed her roughly, offering no explanation. He began to spin her around like a centrifuge while the president desperately screamed for him to let her go. Then, with tremendous force, the zombie threw the woman toward the plane. She crashed into the cargo bay, landing safely inside. Now, with her crew by her side and secreted inside the plane, it was time to escape immediately. Realizing what the mutant had just done for her, the president was suddenly overcome with anguish. Meanwhile, the nuclear warhead continued its descent toward the abandoned city. The protagonist remained calm and confident, patiently waiting for its approach. Once again, gathering a considerable amount of his strength, he shattered the ground beneath his feet. Launching himself into the sky with a powerful leap, he soared toward the ballistic missile. The two were now on a direct collision course. Holding up one hand, the protagonist already knew exactly what he was going to do. As if it were nothing more than a simple baseball, he caught the projectile with a single hand. A feat so incomprehensible that those who witnessed it were left speechless. Immediately afterward, a massive explosion erupted in the sky above the city. The shockwave was so intense that it sent the plane into a sudden burst of turbulence. Behind them, the iconic mushroom cloud began to rise into the sky. Watching the total devastation unfold, the president had no way of knowing if her savior had survived. The city, already abandoned, was now completely destroyed. The buildings that had once been desolate ruins were now almost completely wiped from existence. All the president could do was watch, convinced that nothing could have survived that. But then, unexpectedly, a scorched leg emerged from the thick smoke. The protagonist's clothes were almost completely destroyed, with only the strategically essential areas remaining intact. He scratched at a rather private part of his anatomy, seemingly unaffected, as if all that nuclear energy had only managed to cause a slight annoyance. After witnessing this, the mysterious long-haired man declared that it was time to leave. However, his assistant pointed out that there were still signs of life within the blast radius. The long-haired man scoffed, saying this wasn't the first time they had fought against the academy, nor would it be the last. One day, it would eliminate them all. Meanwhile, the planet set a course back to base. Inside, the president looked completely desolate. Some crew members approached her, concerned for her well-being. One of them remarked that it was truly ironic. She had spent her entire life fighting zombies only to be saved by one in the end. Her assistant stepped forward, explaining that there had likely been a massive misunderstanding. The one who saved her wasn't a zombie at all. He was a hero of the masses who had recently gained a reputation and had actually been living in the city for quite some time. Holding a tablet in her hands, the president crushed it in sheer frustration. Back in the city, people started to notice something unusual. Among them, an almost naked man was walking through the streets as if nothing had happened. The protagonist headed to the nearest phone booth. In the past, these booths were used to make calls as they were equipped with landlines. His subordinates informed him that everyone was safe and they were now looking for a safe place to live. Pleased with the news, he assured them he would meet up with them soon as he found a place to stay. Finally, the protagonist arrived at his apartment. Entered the key code to get inside his home. Inside the intelligence center, thanks to the city surveillance cameras, they had finally discovered the whereabouts of the masked man. The protagonist looked to the side, still deeply bewildered by everything that was happening. The women in the room were just as surprised to see him on the monitor, since he was practically half naked. Once inside his apartment, the protagonist hung some clothes out to dry. Meanwhile, back inside, he resumed his training, motivating himself by looking at a photograph. In it, he was pictured with the strongest of his partners. He hoped they had found their safe place, as he was eager to rent it with them soon. Suddenly, the president burst through his apartment door, startling him. She ordered her men to take every last piece of furniture. Nothing was to be left behind. Immediately, they obeyed her orders. Shocked, the protagonist demanded to know who they were. Threatening to call the police, the president shoved a piece of paper in his face, expecting him to get the message. They were from the Afterlife Academy, and they had come to inform him that he had been accepted. From that day on, the protagonist was now a member of their organization. Discreetly, she gave an order to one of the security guards accompanying her. The man grabbed the protagonist by the hand, who still had no idea what was going on. He tried to protest, saying he was a zombie and couldn't go to school, but they just assumed he was a human in an extremely convincing costume. After a brief exchange, they were all outside. One of the assistants pointed out that this was a bit inappropriate. The academy had extremely rigorous selection criteria and, since the place was organized, it wouldn't even have a run ready upon his arrival. For the president, however, that wasn't a problem. He would just stay in her apartment. Inside the president's apartment, the security team began placing his furniture in the new space. Finally, all the heavy lifting was done. The guard said a polite goodbye, leaving the protagonist standing there, not knowing what to do. The president watched him intently as he remained extremely uncomfortable about everything that had just happened. Feeling completely embarrassed by the situation, he hesitantly asked if he would be staying there permanently and, more importantly, where he would sleep. To the president, it was obvious he would be staying there. She didn't understand why he kept harping on the sleeping arrangement, even jokingly asking if he wanted to sleep next to her. Nervously, he quickly tried to correct himself, saying that wasn't what he meant and that she must have misunderstood. But all he could think about was how absurd it was for a human and a zombie to share the same bed. Sensing his discomfort, the powerful president assured him he would sleep in the guest room. After that clarification, he tried once more to explain his identity, insisting that he was actually a zombie. As he was speaking, the president began to adjust her prosthetic legs. This immediately caught the protagonist's attention, as he hadn't noticed them before. Seeing her remove one of the prosthetics, he instantly panicked, demanding to know what had happened to her legs. With complete indifference, she casually replied that she had cut them off herself. Then, tilting her head, she asked if he had a problem with that. Without hesitation, he quickly assured her that he did not. She let out a deep sigh, lost in thought, as she recalled the events that had led to her decision. The zombie outbreak happened when she was just a little girl. Her parents were infected almost immediately and ended up biting her legs. To survive, she had no choice but to defeat her own parents and cut off her legs. That's why she harbored such a deep and genuine hatred for all zombies, dedicating her entire life to their complete extermination. After this brief, but grim explanation, the protagonist began to sweat nervously, realizing it would be best to avoid certain topics. Noticing that she had interrupted something he was saying earlier, she asked him what it was about. He brushed it off, saying it was nothing, just nonsense, and that it was better if she hadn't heard it. Quickly changing the subject, he asked about this Afterlife Academy. Violet, the president, explained that it was an organization specializing in perfecting ways to fight zombies. It had existed for over 1,000 years, founded 2 centuries after the first outbreak of the zombie pandemic. Its sole purpose was to fight the creatures, and over the centuries, it had produced countless talents. The protagonist's memories weren't clear, but he was sure he had become a zombie during the first outbreak. Pondering the matter, he realized he'd been a zombie for almost a millennium. Violet told him to be ready for the next day. She had used her connections to get him enlisted immediately. His expression exuded distrust more than anything. He wanted to avoid showing up, but Violet warned him not to even think about running away. This was no ordinary organization, an escape would trigger a full-scale investigation into his identity. Finally, she revealed her name, Violet. She also mentioned that a girl named Dawn would escort him to the academy the next day and that they already knew each other. Intrigued by this, the protagonist insisted they didn't know anyone named Dawn. Just then, a familiar hair color appeared in the distance, accompanied by some slightly revealing clothes. Dawn politely greeted the new student while the protagonist remained worried about the whole situation. He stared at her, unable to recognize her at all. This only made her irritation more obvious. He had forgotten everything that happened inside the armored vehicle. The truth was, he remembered perfectly well, but in his memories, she had been much smaller. Hearing this, Dawn had to try very hard not to think her future partner was a complete idiot. She urged him to hurry. It was almost time for the entrance exam. The two of them walked up the stairs leading to a plaza in front of the academy. He didn't know he'd have to take a test. Dawn assured him it was necessary to test the students' physical abilities and their zombie exterminating skills. She used an old world record for the 100-meter dash as an example. To be accepted into the academy, one had to run at least faster than that record. Now, the name Afterlife Academy made more sense. Dawn figured he should have already realized this was a place for extraordinary individuals. In the protagonist's mind, the place was probably full of lunatics. This academy was just a glorified madhouse. There were welcome banners everywhere, and a huge crowd of students had gathered to take the exam. Looking closer, everything seemed really dangerous. Since there were so many people, Dawn had to get on her partner's shoulders to get a better view. An angry man, possibly because he was bald, yelled at her to shut up and that trash like them should stay away. As they argued, the protagonist wondered if someone capable of holding up an entire plane should even be taking the test. But it wasn't that simple. Many people there were capable of feats like that. Not to mention, there was one small detail. Almost no one at the academy watched the TV news. A man with a wooden leg started walking up the stairs, asking everyone to calm down. Clearing his throat, he spoke into the microphone. Welcoming everyone, he announced that it would be the examiner for the day. His name was Chin, and he was the chairman of the sports department. The academy had existed for 800 years, and many great talents had joined its ranks. In the old days, its founders could split entire mountains in half. Today, however, he didn't expect the candidates to do the same. In the middle of the crowd, someone called out to Chairman Chen. It was none other than our beloved protagonist, timidly raising his hand to ask a question. He asked nervously, what would happen if a zombie was inside the academy? The answer was simple. It would be completely dismembered and its body hunt from the academy gates after being neutralized. The protagonist didn't get that last part. What did neutralized mean? Professor Chen clarified that it would separate the zombie's smaller head from its larger body. Just imagining such suffering made the protagonist freeze in horror. Finally, the exams began, starting with the 100-meter dash. The students took their positions, waiting for the referee's signal. The examiner fired the starting pistol, signaling the beginning of the race. The wind caused by the students' movement was so powerful it distorted the referee's facial features. Among them was an exceptionally fast student who was clearly leading the race. The guy moved like lightning, finishing in just 3 seconds. As he crossed the finish line, he had to make a considerable effort to slow down, tearing up the ground in the process, while the protagonist ran as discreetly as possible. Next up was the marksmanship exam, where they had to hit designated targets. Shooting was considered the most basic survival skill in this zombie-infested world. Somehow, the protagonist found himself dragged into the evaluation despite not knowing how they'd ended up in this mess. Getting ready to aim, he observed his classmates' techniques. Down demonstrated incredible expertise with weapons, shown a skill far above the average level. She threw several knives toward the targets. Each blade found its mark, slicing through the heads with extreme precision as if guided by an unseen force. After achieving such a flawless result, she flashed a small smile. She had passed the exam with flying colors. Meanwhile, the protagonist was struggling to figure out how to properly use a firearm. He couldn't help but notice how energetic the other examiners were, and he felt a growing sense of unease. He had to remember Director Chen's words. After all, he was almost certainly the only zombie in the entire city. The next test was a simple throwing event. Candidates had to throw objects at least 80 meters to pass, while a 100 meters or more would place them in the top tier. The first few candidates stepped up to throw. This test proved to be more difficult than the others, and some started to fail. The director called up the next group. The protagonist found himself stuck between these lunatics. To avoid drawing too much attention, he carefully controlled his own strength. While he was completing the tests, Director Chen was analyzing the protagonist's stats, noticing that he was only doing the bare minimum to pass. However, he had received a direct message from Violet. She had assured him that this kid was incredibly strong. Knowing the president's word, Director Chen was sure this guy had to be phenomenal. The only explanation for his mediocre results was that he was deliberately pretending to be weak. One of the candidates stepped forward for the final test, ready to throw a spear. He threw it with the force of a projectile, and the spear cut through the sky like a bullet. It traveled at an incredible speed toward its target. Unfortunately, it hit the training dummy in a very fragile and delicate part of its anatomy. Seeing that scene only made the protagonist more anxious about being found out. The force of the throw was so immense that the spear dragged several dummies along with it. They all ended up impaled against a traffic sign in the city center. People who had no idea this was part of an exam were stunned by the sudden appearance of flying training dummies. Even Director Chen was impressed. This candidate's spear had traveled an astonishing 32 kilometers. That performance was definitely enough to qualify. Now it was the protagonist's turn. As he approached the testing area, the promising candidate who had just thrown his spear tried to intimidate him. The protagonist calmly picked up the spear. He looked up, mentally preparing for his throw. But before he could do anything, Director Chen ordered him to stop, even though he hadn't interrupted anyone else during the entire exam. This immediately caught the other candidate's attention. The director wanted to confirm something. Was this really the man known as Zombie, personally recommended by the fencing president? According to her, Quibble sat in flame. Free was the same person he, and that wasn't reflected in the exam stats. The director wanted to know if he was hiding his true power. Besides, he was the same person who had asked about zombies earlier. Everyone here was given their all to pass. So the director wanted to know if he was given it his all too. Panicking under the scrutiny, the protagonist desperately tried to convince them that he was definitely a person. Absolutely, without a doubt, a real human being. If that were true, then the director ordered him to show his full potential. He didn't need to surpass 32 kilometers. If he could throw at least 10% of that, he would qualify. If he failed, the director would assume he had deceived the president, which would make him a suspected spy, one who would be severely punished. Terrified, the protagonist started to think. He was still afraid of humans. After all, he had spent centuries running from them, and never wanted to be enslaved again. But had lived for so long with a clear goal in mind. They resolved to throw the spear as far as he possibly could. Because of this unusual interaction with the director, all eyes were on him. For the first time during the entire exam, he focused seriously. He remembered the suffering of his strength training. The pain of the bench press, the agony of countless failed bicep curls. The raw power inside his body began to build up so intensely that the ground beneath him started to crack. Then he threw the spear. A massive shockwave erupted from the force, sending a wave of intimidacy through the other candidates. His throw was so powerful that it destroyed a satellite in Earth's orbit. If it weren't for the moon acting as a barrier, the spear would have continued traveling into deep space. The sheer force of his throw violently launched multiple candidates across the field. The ground beneath them had been completely destroyed. Faced with such an overwhelming display of brute force, even Director Chen was left completely speechless. The fact was, if one could see the moon in greater detail, they would notice the damage left by the spear. All of this was caused by just a tiny fraction of the protagonist's power. In the wake of the shockwave, the other examiners started falling from the sky, as if it were raining failures. The protagonist needed a moment to recover, even his facile expression had changed from the sheer intensity of what had just happened. He stared at the moon, still fixed in the sky, certain that his spear had followed a direct path toward it. Finally, he returned to his usual demeanor. Around him, everyone remained completely stunned. Dawn approached him, excited about his results. Even the director was left speechless. She wanted to know how far the spear might have gone, but he couldn't answer. He had simply done his best. Meanwhile, in space, the piece broken off from the moon was now a drifting asteroid, floating aimlessly between the Earth and its satellite. He wasn't happy about the situation. Now that he had officially qualified, the protagonist hoped they could finally go home. Dawn, however, thought that was ridiculous. With that kind of power, he could become president someday. Completely thrilled by his potential, she asked if he had any idea how much power a president could wield. Pondering this, he realized he knew nothing about human society. The most direct example was Violet herself. Her authority allowed her to command a massive army, granting her access to even nuclear weapons. Not only that, but she was the ultimate authority over a city of 30 million people. Although there was technically an elected official, he was just a secretary. The real ruler was her. The protagonist tried to mention that he already had his own city, but Dawn completely ignored him, dragging him off to another location. They had now arrived at the biotechnology department, the place where special weapons were made, also known as the logistics department. As they walked through the facility, something peculiar caught the protagonist's eye. In front of him was a small photograph of what looked like a happy family. The photo belonged to Professor Jaime, who was presumed dead. He was the former head of this department. After losing his wife, he had become obsessed with crazy experiments, the kind that involved both humans and zombies. Because of this, he had been fired for going completely insane. Just then, a woman with glasses greeted them, asking if they were new students and if they had passed the academy's entrance exam. And, indeed, they had both been officially admitted. Zombie wanted to know who this woman was. Dawn explained that she was Professor Jaime's adopted daughter and was now the current head of the biotechnology department. Inviting them to sit, she asked what kind of equipment they would need. With a twinkle in her eye, Dawn eagerly asked for something that would let her carry even more weapons. Her childish imagination suggested a skirt that could hide a huge machine gun. In short, she would be joining the gunners group. Then, the scientist turned to the protagonist, wanting to know what he wanted. But after asking the question, she received no answer. Revealing his very low self-esteem, the zombie timidly asked if she had really been talking to him. Getting a better look at his face, the woman suddenly turned pale with terror. She immediately realized he was a zombie. Dawn, still smiling, brushed it off, insisting it was just a very convincing mask. The scientist, now completely alarmed, asked if Dawn was stupid or actively choosing to ignore the reality. That was clearly a zombie. At this point, the zombie was already trembling with fear. Dawn insisted she wasn't lying. She had seen part of his face during the last exam. Now, a little calmer, the scientist hesitated. If he really were a zombie, wouldn't they have attacked someone by now? Still, she repeated her question. What kind of gear did he want? After thinking for a moment, he confirmed that every time he used his strength, he always ended up going home naked. So, his request was simple. He wanted clothes that would never tear. An unusual request, which made the scientist pause to think. She jotted down the requests. A girl who wanted to carry more weapons and a zombie who simply didn't want to end up naked. Meanwhile, in the reserved fencing area, a group was gathered, deep in thought. Among them was Marshall, who had been completely annihilated by the protagonist. A woman was lying on a bench, a book covering her face, waiting to hear the report. The samurai explained that his opponent was truly powerful. The moment he attacked, his vision went completely black, and in the next second, his body was already hanging from a lamppost. The woman wanted to know if their division's president would be able to defeat this creature. Without hesitation, the samurai admitted that this being was even stronger than their own president. Finally, the woman sat up, slamming her book on the table. She wanted to know the name of the person who had defeated him. A blue-haired woman landed in, listening intently to the answer. After hearing it, she dismissed him, saying he was free to go. Her name was Jan Lankani and she was the president of the Sword Division. There was a fierce rivalry between the Sword Division and the Blade Division. As he left, the samurai wished her a good day. During theory class, the students were learning about the habits of zombies. They discovered that zombies also like to eat eggs and that this knowledge could be used to set traps. Zombie seemed to be a very dedicated student, diligently taking notice on everything he heard. Dawn got curious about what he was writing and asked him what he was doing. It told her it wanted to share this knowledge with his family. Of all the things it could have said, this was definitely not what she expected. Suddenly, a loud announcement echoed throughout the school, summoning everyone to the gym immediately. Dawn found this sudden assembly strange. It hadn't been long since they last gathered. Slowly, the students began to fill the center of the gym. They just wanted to know what was going on. As they casually ate ice cream, Violet ordered them to be quiet. Meanwhile, Dawn was amazed that her partner could still eat with a mask on. It tried to explain how it was possible, but as was talking, a group of individuals began to approach. The blue-haired girl watched the protagonist from a distance. Facet, since he had already fallen in battle before, she figured it couldn't be that strong. She asked if she should go over and test this guy. Her president gave her approval. Immediately, she unsheathed her sword. But before anything could happen, a new group of individuals entered the gym. At the front was the chief, followed by an army of robots. His mere presence was enough to make all the students start moving. Dawn quickly ordered her partner to stop staring and bow. This was the mechanical life department. As the machines filled the room, everyone bowed in silence. The presidents exchanged brief glances. He warned the girl not to start any conflict in this place. At the reprimand, she said she would leave. But as she walked away, she asked if they still planned to test the guy's skills somehow. However, there was a quick change of plans. The chief was much more important than this guy, and she only respected the truly strong. The chief approached Violet, acknowledging that she had been working hard, but she simply replied that it was just her job. Zombie wondered if something was going on between the two of them. The atmosphere had completely changed. Looking at his partner, he asked if the chief was really such a powerful figure. Dawn was then reminded of Professor Jaime, the man who had been exiled from the academy. The chief was an upgraded version of a modern human, the masterpiece of that mad professor, the only one out of thousands who survived brutal experiments. Now he ruled a city of 50 million people. And in 10 years of leadership, not a single zombie had appeared in his city. The mere sight of a single zombie here led to the violent cleansing of the entire area. Stepping onto the stage, the chief announced it would be brief. Although they were all newcomers, the academy needed help. The students listened in complete silence. Looking at one of his machines, he ordered a projection to be displayed immediately. From what appeared to be the eye on his face, a hologram of a seated person was projected. This was a spy they had captured months ago. Because of him, a nuclear disaster almost occurred. Zombie immediately seethed with rage. This was the man who had fired the nuclear weapon at him. Although the spy deserved to be punished, he possessed information too valuable to get rid of him. He was a loyal subordinate of Professor Jaime. The protagonist realized there was more than one enemy threatening humanity. Currently, the threat of zombies had diminished. The greatest danger to humanity was humanity itself. Clearly, there were still people who just wanted to watch the world burn. They had tried countless interrogation methods, but none had succeeded. Not even the senior students had been able to break him. So far, no method, no matter how cruel, had managed to make the spy talk. That's why the chief had turned to the newcomers. Any help would be welcome. Whoever managed to make him talk would be immediately promoted to the position of vice president. The newcomers lit up at the promise of power. A large crowd of them eagerly volunteered to interrogate the spy. Looking at them, the chief announced that the prisoner was in a room outside and wished them luck. 2 hours passed, and the situation remained unchanged. The newcomers had gotten creative, trying unorthodox interrogation methods. Violet watched with her hand on her face, unimpressed by their ineffective tactics. Dawn wondered if her new friend could make the prisoner talk. The truth was, if he wanted to, ZOMBI could make the man sing like a bird. Hearing those words didn't make Dawn doubt him. On the contrary, she was even more excited. Raising her hand, she caught the chief's attention, announcing that her friend had a way to make the spy talk. Since they had nothing to lose, the chief immediately directed them to the interrogation room. Although she was excited, Dawn found ZOMBI's sudden willingness strange. Until now, he had been trying to fly under the radar. ZOMBI's obedientes were always obedient, but for some reason, some have been losing control lately. Perhaps this year will provide some answers. Entered the room, coming face to face with the prisoner. On the other side, the spy wasn't surprised at all. He simply saw that another person had arrived. The protagonist approached him as the prisoner watched him cautiously. They stared at each other for a brief moment without saying a word. Assuming the academy had run out of interrogators, the spy made it clear that he would never betray his brother Faye. The moment he finished speaking, ZOMBI moved fast. In a split second, he made a small cut on the spy's arm. After enduring countless interrogation sessions, the spy had no idea what such a small wound could mean. He laughed hysterically. He wasn't afraid of anything. This was nothing more than a mosquito bite. ZOMBI then gave a simple command. He ordered the spy to stand up. Without even thinking, the spy obeyed. This immediately caught the attention of all the important figures in the room. Something inside that small wound had forced him to obey. Tiny cells had entered the spy's bloodstream. They were now traveling through his body and had already reached his brain. The spy's body was trembling, not because he was afraid, but because he had completely lost control of himself. He no longer had any say in his own existence. ZOMBI's first question was simple, his name. The answer came immediately. His name was Shock Kai. Dawn was shocked. She had just witnessed her friend's ability to control someone's mind. Assuming his Jaime subordinate, the spy must know a lot. The protagonist asked if that was the case. The young man confirmed that he knew almost everything. With that in mind, ZOMBI wanted to know why the zombies were losing control. The answer was a drug, one that had been secretly released in the city. The zombies who consumed it went crazy and, in some cases, could even be controlled remotely. They sent these zombies to attack humans, gathering combat data to annihilate the Afterlife Academy. The protagonist demanded to know why they were doing this. The spy didn't know the full answer, but he did know that his superior was excited. Jaime was collecting critical data for some unknown purpose. When asked where Jaime was now, the spy revealed that he was in a secret base 500 meters underground, beneath the city. After hearing the answer, ZOMBI ordered the spy to turn his back. As he left the room, he spoke in zombie language, saying that humans were hateful creatures, and that the virus inside the spy's brain could end his life, whenever ZOMBI wished, but instead, he hoped the man could change his ways. The spy understood the message, and the door closed behind the protagonist as he walked away. Meanwhile, Professor Jaime was exactly where the spy had said. They had already received information that their captured agent had revealed important information. The Afterlife Academy probably knew their exact location. Still, Jaime remained calm and thought this wasn't important to him. They had to continue their research. In fact, he was glad the Academy was coming to him. His assistant panicked. This was too dangerous, but since the experiment was about to be completed, Jaime wasn't worried at all. Approaching one of his creations, he declared that the timing was perfect. He wanted his enemies to witness this historic moment, the birth of a new life form. ZOMBI walked out of the interrogation room as if nothing had happened. Outside, he was watched with fear by the other students. Whispers spread among those who had seen what he had done. Even Violet seemed uneasy. The true scale of his power was beginning to sink in. The blue-haired woman was equally intrigued by what had happened. It was unanimous, everyone now believed that he somehow had the ability to control minds. The bosses started clapping, saying that ZOMBI had done an excellent job. He declared that this new generation would surpass the previous one. He didn't expect such talent to appear among the rookies. Since he had promised to make him vice president, he would do it immediately as long as ZOMBI was officially registered. ZOMBI, however, was more concerned about Jaime's whereabouts. The boss, however, knew he wouldn't run away. They continued walking, being watched closely by the blue-haired woman. Her subordinate found it strange, there wasn't supposed to be a procedure to become vice-president. They decided to follow them. The group entered an isolated area, an industrial zone. ZOMBI had no idea why they had gone there. He had assumed they were heading off to complete his registration. The boss suddenly asked him, "When did you learn to speak human language?" Because he knew that ZOMBI was a zombie. ZOMBI looked confused. Was the boss really talking to him? Turning towards him, the boss raised his weapon. "Yes," he said, "I'm talking to you." Then he fired. A powerful shot hit ZOMBI directly. The blue-haired woman and her subordinate, watching in secret, were almost caught in the blast. By some miracle, they were unharmed. The weapon used was the boss's Taken cannon, a weapon capable of disintegrating any form of matter. The boss declared that he would never be fooled by a zombie. He wanted to know what the idiots at the academy were thinking. How had something like this gone unnoticed? But in the end, it didn't matter, because all zombies had the same weakness, their heads. And with their heads destroyed, they stopped moving. The zombie had entered a place he should have never gone. The protagonist's hand was already reaching for the boss's face. A series of fast movements followed until a wall was destroyed, sending debris flying everywhere. The boss suddenly found a zombie hand gripping his throat. At that very moment, other figures emerged. The robots that always followed the boss appeared instantly. They fired their powerful beams without hesitation. A massive explosion erupted, engulfing the entire area. When the smoke cleared, the protagonist was standing there holding a destroyed combat drone. Taking advantage of the chaos, the boss had escaped, jumping to safety, shuffling across the cold concrete. He was still in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His robots had been completely destroyed. That zombie should be dead. No headless body should be able to move. And yet, the headless body was still active. The blue-haired woman and her subordinate were just as stunned as the boss. Without a word, the zombie kept on fighting. The boss had to stay completely focused, because he had barely avoided being decapitated himself. Somehow, he managed to dodge every attack thrown at him. Managing to buy some time, the boss readied his cannon once more. He fired another shot, but this time he failed to hit his target. He was completely unable to understand why the zombie was so agile, even without a head. But there was no time to think, he needed to focus on keeping his own head. Once again, he gained some distance to avoid being hit by the zombie. The subordinate assumed he was in trouble, but the blue-haired woman claimed the boss was just getting started. People like him preferred to show off overwhelming power. It was better to back off before they got caught in the conflict. Finally, something began to form on the zombie's body. His head had completely regenerated. Watching it grow back left everyone stunned. The protagonist suggested they talk, since it had no intention of harming anyone present. The boss remained silent for a long moment, having just realized his neck had been slightly injured. Figuring that the zombie's real goal was to control his mind, he refused to comply. It took off his coat, revealing his robotic body. Model number 1, it gave the order and a different robot began to approach. As it got closer, its parts separated and began to attach to him. A transformation was underway, and the protagonist could only watch. He didn't know what he was witnessing, but the boy on the rooftop was amazed. Now the boss was covered in sleek, high-tech armor. After all, he was a mechanical life form, and it wasn't in his nature to negotiate with zombies. As the first zombie to witness this form, the protagonist should feel honored. The boss was now faster and much more powerful, striking with devastating force. He positioned himself in the air to deliver a crushing blow to the protagonist. His attack was so overwhelming that he managed to send him flying. The blue-haired woman and her student were shocked by the intensity of the battle. But the boss wasn't done yet. He hadn't shown the full extent of his offensive power. While the zombie was still in the air, he struck him several times. Each attack was precise and brutal, yet his opponent didn't even react to a single blow. This only made the boss even more confident, even though the zombie's body remained completely intact. This time, he hit hard enough to send his opponent crashing into the ground. His body slammed into the concrete like a soccer ball. Moments later, the boss landed as well. Toim, all zombies needed to be exterminated. He crossed his arms in front of his chest, as if it were charging up a total destruction attack. Then, he unleashed a deadly energy being capable of consuming everything in its path. The blue-haired woman was stunned by such a display of power. It was the same beam he had used before, but this time it was exponentially stronger. Shockwaves swept through the abandoned city. Nothing could have possibly survived that attack. The boss exhaled heavily, exhausted from what had just done. He hoped his enemy was finally gone, but then he saw him casually walking in his direction. The boss couldn't believe it. This shouldn't be possible. For the first time in the battle, the protagonist acted differently. He roared, completely enraged. The force of his shout violently blasted the debris away. The blue-haired woman had to shield herself from the dust. Even the boss had to cover his ears. The roar was too intense. The protagonist had transformed, defied the rules of Dragon Ball, and now had a pair of ears and hair. No one had any idea what had just happened to the zombie. Shown off his new hairstyle, he approached the boss. By this point, the boss had accepted it. He had no idea what the being in front of him really was. The protagonist's skin tone was still the same, but his hair looked like something that had been popular in the early 2010s. Slowly, the dust began to settle, and in the sky above them, the clouds grew even darker. A huge swirl of clouds began to form. Dawn, looking out the window, noticed something was wrong. The blue-haired president's student was also worried. This wasn't normal at all. Inside the city, bystanders were confused. They didn't understand why the sky had suddenly darkened. It was the first time they'd ever seen anything like it. Back at the battle, the boss couldn't say a word. He was dealing with a bigger problem, one that had just occurred inside his briefs. The protagonist spoke. He had given this arrogant human several chances to settle things peacefully. Now he wanted to know something very specific. Did the boss have an intense desire to find out if there's life after death? His entire personality had changed. The blue-haired woman felt a deep sense of dread. She knew they had to leave immediately. The boss, despite his fear, refused to back down. Since the day he was born, he had never felt threatened by any living being, and there was no way some bad guy was going to be the first. Bracing himself, he dared the creature to try something. Meanwhile, the blue-haired woman and her student continued their escape. There was no record of a zombie like this in the Academy's database, and they didn't even know if they were far enough away yet. Before she could say anything, an object suddenly flew past them. The danger level of the battle was beyond anything seen so far. The boss's body had seen better days. Now he was nothing more than a broken, overconfident paperweight. The bald protagonist simply watched calmly. He knew this human was no longer a threat. Even in his weakened state, the boss was still trying. He called for more of his robot models. They marched into battle without fear. They felt nothing. Multiple explosions erupted immediately after. Somehow, the blue-haired woman had managed to rescue the boss. That zombie was seriously dangerous. She would need help to defeat him. Realizing how serious the situation was, the blue-haired woman scolded the boss. He was insane, and never should have provoked him. They decided to split up and escape. But let's give the boss a round of applause. He still managed to do something stupid, even as a paperweight. The protagonist noticed the humans had started to run. It was time to show them something truly interesting. The blue-haired woman had no idea what was about to happen. Suddenly, huge cracks started spreading across the ground. It was the protagonist's hand that had caused it right under their feet. An earthquake had started. It happened too fast. There was already an obstacle in their path. Everything unfolding before their eyes was just surreal. With a single hand, the zombie was doing something truly unbelievable. Even the paperweight found his escape completely cut off, defying both the laws of physics and common sense. Half of the city rose into the air, as if it were a wall. The massive structure now dominated the horizon. Inside the city, bystanders couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. Dawn realized it was as if the city itself was floating. Even though she was far from the battle, it was obvious that something extraordinary was happening. All of this was caused by the protagonist's sheer strength. With the human's escape completely blocked, it resumed his pursuit of the paperweight. Grabbing his face with one hand, it dragged him to the edge of the city. With the paperweight in his grasp, he asked, "Now, do you feel threatened?" Holding the mangled man in his hand, the protagonist was not impressed at all. In the end, A confirmed something. He was right. He couldn't control a robot's mind. But since the boss was still part human, his brain must still be intact. He tightened his grip on the paperweight's skull, sending a command to the vital cells in his bloodstream. The virus had reached his brain. Suddenly, the protagonist saw his memories. Ever since he was a child, he had been an orphan. He had undergone numerous body modifications. So many that there was almost nothing human left of him. The protagonist was sure this paperweight's life was miserable. Staying alive was more painful than dying, dropping him off the edge of the cliff. Esperarem. Seeing those memories had rinety smooth. Luckily, Ed didn't die from the fall. He was saved by the blue-haired woman. She had witnessed the entire final interaction. She was stunned that the zombie could read memories. With nothing left to do there, he vanished in a flash. The next morning, he woke up in a panic. He knew he had lost control of his emotions again. Being in that form was terrifying for him. He had to constantly remind himself that he was a good and kind zombie. After packing his bags, he got ready to leave the human city. But just as he tried to sneak away, Violet showed up. She demanded to know, "Where do you think you're going?" Still in shock, A started to worry. He didn't want to silence a witness. Rushing towards her, A apologized for what he was about to do. But his attack came to a screeching halt when he saw something strange, a document. It was his official appointment as vice-president. The document was simply a formalization of what had already earned. Holding the paper in his hands, A stood there, unable to comprehend the situation. He could hardly believe it was real. Was that really the chief's signature? Violet confirmed it. A immediately asked, "Did the chief say anything?" According to Violet, the only thing the chief said was, "The vice president is an excellent human being." As she left, she added, "I look forward to the day you become president. On that day, you will finally achieve what you set out to do." Inside the hospital room, the paperweight was slowly recovering. The blue-haired woman was frustrated by his decision, because now they had a zombie as a vice-president. But for the chief, that wasn't the issue. The creator's strength was necessary to capture Professor Jaime. Still, the woman remained cautious. What if the zombie lost control again? The chief didn't care. Instead, A asked, "Have you prepared everything?" Now there was only one objective, to completely eradicate Professor Jaime. On the ocean, several enormous warships were sailing. Meanwhile, at the zombie shelter, one of them was riling up the masses. They claimed that their king had been captured by humans. The king was their only pillar of support. They couldn't lose him like this. Slowly, more and more zombies began to agree with the idea of retaliation. Some of the other leaders just watched Barman's stupidity, but decided not to intervene because only the king could stop this. Meanwhile, the aircraft carrier continued on its course across the ocean. The chief gave an order to all personnel. "This is our only chance to capture Professor Jaime, whatever it takes." In an abandoned city, the protagonist was walking alongside Dawn. She was amazed by the place. Suddenly, a large regiment of soldiers approached. They stood before him and saluted. They were ready to receive orders from their new, all-powerful leader, the zombie vice president. They declared their loyalty. They were the 4th Division. From now on, they would only take orders from him. The poor zombie was left speechless. I never expected to have so much military power. That regiment alone not only had countless battle tanks, it was made up of 12,000 soldiers. Not believing they would obey any order, the protagonist asked what the soldier would do if he ordered him to end his own life. Without hesitation, the soldier immediately pulled out a grenade, declaring that the vice-president's orders were absolute. It had been an honor to serve him. The zombie panicked and quickly told him to stop. A had only been joking. A had to throw the grenade far away before A could finally breathe a sigh of relief. A side character with main character syndrome was struggling to accept the vice-president's authority, assuming A must be weak. He couldn't understand why someone so frail was in charge of such a critical region. They introduced themselves as members of the Stainless Steel Academy. They had been sent to assist in the capture of the target. Dawn recognized them immediately. They were President Bang and Vice President Chewie. They looked incredibly strong. Meanwhile, on the aircraft carrier, a samurai was questioning his presence on this mission. He didn't understand why he had been deployed, or how a newcomer had been promoted to vice president. The blue-haired woman reminded him that he was sent to help, not to give his opinion. He needed to understand his place. Gang, however, was still confused. Why had they put a rookie in charge of such a strategic position? The chief replied nonchalantly, "If you don't believe in him, the rookie can beat you until you cry." Gang laughed, thinking it was a bluff. He was sure he was stronger than the chief. Inside his fortress, Professor Jaime observed a massive military mobilization. The city where he was hiding was completely surrounded by enemies. He authorized the release of the zombies. With just the push of a button, a horde of the undead advanced. A young man with glasses noticed something strange among them. One of the zombies was different. There were a lot of them, but they were no match for modern firearms. The overconfident side characters complained that the task was too easy. As they approached the fallen zombies, the protagonist noticed something. They didn't belong to his tribe. Dawn, standing beside him, pretended she hadn't heard anything. The cocky soldier mocked the vice president, telling him to go back home to safety since he was useless. Weaklings like him should be playing video games instead. That comment irritated the protagonist, but before A could react, they were suddenly interrupted by the arrival of a powerful zombie. Looking at the creature, the protagonist recognized it immediately. He had no idea what little varmint was doing there. The young man with the glasses was thrilled. It was the first time he'd ever seen such a powerful zombie. Excitedly, he hoped the creature would put on a real show. Hours earlier, Varmint had failed to convince the other zombies to join him. Only number 7 had followed him. 7 had only come to drop off some gasoline and planned to leave right away. He refused to disobey the king's orders, but he wished his friend good luck. Varmint was confident the king wouldn't find out. He called his companion a coward. Brimming with self-confidence, he declared that he didn't need anyone. He could take out the humans all by himself. Then, suddenly, he caught a strange scent. It was that smell that alerted the mad scientist to his presence. And so, little Varmint had run into the human forces. Dawn had no idea what that creature was. Meanwhile, the protagonist was worried about his friend. Varmint started drinking straight from the gas can. The liquid spilled all over his body due to his ravenous chugging. Dawn was completely bewildered by what she was witnessing. Finally, the zombie reveled up its chainsaw. With a furious roar, it prepared to start the massacre. The sound was so intense that the windows shattered as Dawn covered her ears. Even the other soldiers had to shield themselves from the noise. The only one affected was the protagonist. The sonic shockwave was so powerful it sent people flying in all directions. Dawn was growing more and more terrified. This creature was dangerous. Varmint, filled with rage, declared his intention to eliminate all humans. One of the stainless steel soldiers was thrilled at the chance to fight. He believed they could win. The vice president didn't hesitate. He grabbed Dawn's arm and started running. She didn't understand why they were fleeing. There were 2 powerful warriors who could help. With perfect calm, the protagonist explained that the stainless steel soldiers had no chance of winning. Dawn was worried by that statement. He assured her wasn't kidding. That chainsaw zombie was really strong. Then he revealed the truth. Varmint possessed an immortal body. The stainless steel soldiers laughed at the vice president for running away, but before they could continue mocking him, one of their own was suddenly knocked senseless. He was thrown with such force that he crashed into a battle tank. The cocky soldier turned to see what had just happened. But now his back was turned to his opponent. On the other side, his subordinate was foaming at the mouth, completely unconscious. Only then did he realize the zombie was right in front of him. Varmint, with a chilling politeness, asked, "How would you like to die? Go hide upstairs." On the roof of a building, the protagonist had gotten his allies to safety. On the avenue below, the destruction raged uncontrollably. The guy with the glasses was thrilled. This was the most powerful zombie he had ever seen. The stainless steel soldier, however, was not enjoying how the fight was going. One moment he was getting pummeled at, and the next, he was getting pummeled again. That supposedly strong human was nothing more than a toy in his enemy's hands. He hit the ground like a rotten fruit fallen from a tree, only to be immediately kicked in the head, like a penalty kick. His body flew across the battlefield, crashing into his already unconscious subordinate. Finally, the chainsaw-wielding creature approached, its weapon still roaring viciously. It was at that moment the stainless steel soldier realized he could never wear that pair of underwear again. If it weren't for the blade on his arm, it would have been in deep trouble. Up on the rooftop, the protagonist silently watched the battle. Dawn was nervous, but she was sure that soldier wouldn't survive much longer. Down below, the stainless steel soldier did his best to turn the fight around. He stared into the creature's eyes, only to freeze in terror and scream for his mommy. He didn't want to die like this. A genuinely embarrassing moment witnessed it by two people who wished they hadn't seen it. Meanwhile, hidden in his lab, the mad scientist reveled in the suffering of humans. The beatdown continued while the protagonist simply watched. Regular soldiers couldn't be deployed, it would be completely useless. Filled with fear, one of them asked the vice president, "What are you actually going to do?" The protagonist didn't understand why his own subordinate hadn't recognized him. Turning to Dawn, it told her, "You'll be responsible for beating some sense into that thing." Dawn immediately panicked. She was sure she wasn't capable of doing anything. Then, the vice president held out his hand, asked her to extend her arm, and then bit her. Dawn screamed in shock. It took her a moment to process what had just happened. She thought it was about to control her mind and turn her into a puppet, but the zombie reassured her, "I'm not that kind of guy." All he asked was, "Just don't hit it too hard." On the battlefield, the stainless steel soldier was still squirming for his life. The chainsaw zombie was enjoying his suffering. Then, a voice interrupted, "That doesn't look like any fun at all." The zombie turned, hearing the sound of a mocking laugh. Dawn stepped forward, dragging a massive machine gun. Completely transformed, she challenged the monster. "Why don't you play with me instead?" The zombie cells inside her body activated immediately. They spread rapidly, rewriting her original genetic code. New nucleotides were formed, and she became something completely different from what she once was. The chainsaw zombie was intrigued by this little girl standing before him. Then he became furious. "How dare such a small, insignificant creature act so boldly?" Dawn smirked, "You're just a show-off, and honestly, there's nothing special about you." Before he could answer, she unleashed a hail of bullets. The projectiles flew forward, but the zombie didn't move. It dodged effortlessly, weaving between the shots like it was nothing. Meanwhile, the stainless steel soldier curled up in the fetal position, trying to hide. The poor guy was crying, praying that no one would find out what happened to his underwear. The battle grew fiercer, and the other stainless steel soldier took the opportunity to rescue his commander. By then, Dawn had closed the distance. She could have landed a powerful blow, but instead, she shoved multiple grenades into the chainsaw zombie's mouth. "This is just for dessert," she whispered. Then, she detonated them. The explosion sent her flying backward, but the chainsaw zombie just dusted himself off. That didn't even hurt. In fact, it tickled. Before he could finish his sentence, Dawn punched him in the face again and again. She was having a blast. She liked the fact that he was a sturdy punching bag. Terrified, the soldier asked the vice president, "What did you do to her?" And they learned that her genes had been modified. Without a doubt, she could still get stronger. Finally, Barmint admitted that he was starting to feel pain. Meanwhile, Dawn was smiling uncontrollably. She loved this feeling. The stainless steel soldiers didn't know what was scarier at this point. Without hesitation, Barmint declared, "That little bit of strength of yours isn't enough to stop me," but he was abruptly caught off guard. The girl had already jumped onto his chainsaw. She kicked him in the face so hard it practically grew wings. As his body flew through the air, his expression couldn't hide the pain he felt. Arrow led across the ground for several yards, completely overwhelmed. Face down, he struggled to understand what had just happened. Still, the battle raged on, completely destroying the avenue. The stainless steel soldiers were stunned by the girl's strength. They figured she had been faking her weakness the whole time. Lifting a huge bazooka, she announced, "It's time for a little bang bang." From his position, the protagonist noticed something unusual. Barmint was complaining about his pain. Then, he grabbed another can of gasoline to drink. Both combatants were having the time of their lives. Meanwhile, the stainless steel soldiers were in a total panic. The bazooka fired. The projectile shot towards the creature, but mid-flight, the missile was sliced in half. Barmint had moved so fast it caught the girl by surprise. Her body was torn to shreds in the process. The air filled with an overwhelming red mist. The stainless steel soldiers were horrified. To them, she was already dead. Varmint confidently declared, "I cannot be defeated, humans are just wasting their time trying." On the rooftop, the protagonist clenched his fist. That simple gesture was enough to command the zombie cells to work their magic. Her body began to regenerate completely. Varmint watched in disbelief. It couldn't comprehend what was happening. It was then that Dawn spoke, "I'm turning undead too." The stainless steel soldiers were completely horrified as her wounds were fully restored. The fight between them seemed endless. Dawn wanted to keep having fun. The stainless steel soldiers, however, were terrified. They had never seen so many lunatics in one place. At this point, all they wanted was for someone to save them. Varmint was in shock, and no longer knew who the real zombie was in this battle. The vice president watched intently. Meanwhile, his soldier was trying his best not to soil his underwear again. He didn't expect the girl to become so powerful. Her body was evolving rapidly. The pain he was feeling was extremely real. Knowing it to end this quickly, it was time to discipline his subordinate. Dawn was becoming more dangerous as the fight went on. With lightning-fast agility, she closed the distance between her and her opponent once more. Her attacks were so fast and powerful that Varmint couldn't react. He was thrown around the city like a punching bag. Battered from every angle at the girl's hands, he had become completely useless. Lying on the ground, defeated, he struggled to understand what this creature before him was. It got no answer.